His last lines of a poem, let all your thinks be thanks. But in the Torah, isn't it right that you've got a trio? You've got gratitude, memory, remembering, and history. Again and again they're told, remember, remember, remember. It's when we forget we're ungrateful. And the Jewish festivals are not festivals of nature, like the Canaanites. They're festivals of history. God did this for you then.
Is that part of, you suppose that remembering is associated thematically with the notion of honoring your mother and your father? Because to remember is to remember the traditions of the past. Well, yeah.
What you owe.
One of the things that's really struck me about our modern culture, especially the culture that we pass on to young people, is that we don't stress the necessity of gratitude. We view the past as, well, a patriarchal tyranny, let's say, and there are elements of the past that are both patriarchal and tyrannical. But my sense always is, well, yeah, but if you plug in your toaster in the wall, it works. And when you go outside, the houses aren't burning down and there aren't riots everywhere.
So if the pagans depended on nature, we depend on technology.
In order to cultivate a craving, the Bible seems to be pointing out, in order to really, truly cultivate a craving, you have to rewrite history. And so that's actually what happens here. It says that they start to cultivate a craving for me.
Here.
That's what I'm saying. So because what the text actually says, right?
No, I mean here in America.
Oh,
right.
Yeah. So the text, right, exactly. So the text says that right after the people begin to cultivate a craving, listen to the way that the Bible characterizes the Israelite complaint, right? They say, "Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost." And they were slaves, but the way they remember that is it didn't cost us anything because we didn't have to buy it. Right?
Well, the same thing happened with post-Soviet nostalgia.
That's right.
Exactly.
Remember the good old days under Stalin. It's like
the part of this.
Stalin
to me,
is positively regarded by a majority of Russians to this day.
For me, what's interesting is that the ingratitude leads immediately to regression. And there's the Jungian term I always forget, which I ask you, that's regression to a prior archetype. What's that name when you...
Oh yes, I'll remember that in a moment, yeah. Retrogressive restoration of the persona.
Right, it's basically like midlife crisis, in a way. It's like you're in this time of change, you're getting close to something, right? And you're out of, like, I think of this image a lot in terms of, like, you're a hermit crab on the bottom of the ocean and you've outgrown your shell, right? And you're scuttling out, but you're naked and you're vulnerable and predators swirl everywhere. And you don't even know if there's another shell that's out there that you can fill. That's very much the state right now of the Israelites. And you have to have faith to keep going, that not only will you find something out there, but that it will be more capacious, that you can fill it in a greater way. And so many people seek to kind of scuttle back to the thing that they ill-fit before and kind of cram themselves back into something.
Well, that was a pre-existent state of order, right? So there is a validity. There is a validity in nostalgia for the past, and the validity is, well, we weren't dying then, and that's the truth. And so,
but it's not a fit that you can wear again. It's like,
that's the danger.
It's the siren song of a midlife crisis, let's say. If I just go back and do this over again, it was better.
That would be the pathology of an unthinking conservatism. Right,
but they're misremembering.
That worship of the past.
Yeah, they're misremembering. That's the point. It's not just, oh, we survived, or at least we were alive back then. It was like we had all this extraordinary food. And I think a little bit later, they actually describe this kind of a shocking verse to me, Egypt as the land of milk and honey, flowing with milk and honey. I think that's right, isn't it? It's just an extraordinary kind of, it's not just forgetfulness
or
misremembering.
It's the projection of the destination into the past.
Exactly. The destination they're journeying to, as it were, is just flipped around as if they're heading back. Yeah.
So now the Israelites have a state, and now they're tempted by ingratitude, and the ingratitude makes them murmur, and the murmuring is, in a sense, calling forth another tyrant, and that's what Moses is objecting to. He's saying, now the burden is too great on me again. And God returns to this notion of subsidiary responsibility once again, right? So to even address this issue of emergent, lustful ingratitude, it's the same remedy.
I just want to point out one thing, just for an image and people to understand the relationship of this. I keep pointing to this fractal structures. I want people to realize the Bible is so coherent. It's crazy. You know, this idea of they want to eat flesh, that they want to eat animals. And in the hierarchy of things, you know, the animals are on the outside. The animals are that which is being sacrificed. They're on the edge. And so God burns the edge of the camp. It's almost like that's what they want, and that's where the fire comes. It comes from to the edge of the camp, kind of singes the edge. And so there's that, because you'll see later an image of the Miriam who is too pure. But here you have this sense in which what they want is the animality, like they want to dive into the flesh. And the result of that is this,
gluttony.
But the result is something like cutting off some part of the edge, a kind of circumcision, you could say, like cutting off the flesh.
And Jordan, in accordance with what you're saying, which is this kind of attempt to, the desire for a tyrant that they want that's borne out by this, look at the language that's used where the people are, right? So it says, Moses heard the people weeping, clan by clan, each one at his tent's opening. The last time you saw that language is when Moses was in the tent of meeting by himself, right before the reestablishment of the tabernacle. He's out there, they're each at their tent's opening, and they're looking this way so they're treating Moses like, you're the tyrant, give us what we want, right? We want the person who can provide us the meat. And Moses is saying, I don't want this. Why are you giving this to me?
It's too much for him.
It's too much for me. I can't do this. And God says, okay, fine. So then the answer is that I'm going to take some of your, it's, again, more tragedy for Moses. The glory that I've put upon you that comes from my relationship with you, I'm now going to spread to these 70 elders who are going to help you carry the burden. And it kind of gets worse from here, actually.
And the image, what's interesting is what the image ends up being is something that God promised in the curse, which is that you will eat and you will not be satisfied. And so then it's almost, God is going to say, oh, you want meat? Oh, you're going to have so much meat that you're going to be disgusted of it. Like you're going to loathe it by the amount of meat that you're going to have.
Which, by the way, is actually pretty good therapy. Like if you ever have a kid who really
has a craving,
you just like have a family friend, yeah, exactly, who did this with cigarettes, found their kid smoking, and was like, okay, here's an entire pack. You're going to smoke this entire pack right now. Kid never smoked again. Right?
Right. So, do you want to continue from verse 18, or do you want me to go?
Well, we were going to move from verse 14 to 27, unless there's something else
that is back in chapter 10 that you're in.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, I'll return to that for now, and then we'll pick it up. Yeah, so this is just more of this subsidiary organization, just the narrative part of that Ben commented on, the differentiation of the social order right to the tribal level, 14 to 27 in Numbers. In the first place went the standard of the camp of the children of Judah according to their armies, and over his host was Nahshon, the son of Amminadab. Thus,
then after that, because you're going to skip to 28, but then after that you have all the tribes described with their standards. Basically, they're walking ahead, like in order, depending on their different identities.
Right. And so what we have here to point out why this is relevant is that the Israelites are on the move again, but there's a hierarchical structure to their movement as well, to their movement forward, and that's in keeping with their tribal allegiance.
That's right. Yeah.
Right, and that's part of a subsidiary structure. So when you're moving forward, obviously, when you have an organization, when you have a staff, which is an interesting term because it's the same idea as the staff of Moses, you differentiate your staff hierarchically, and then you move forward with your staff, like in a business organization, you move forward with your staff towards the desired end in a hierarchical manner. It's like a phalanx.
By the way, it's fascinating that the tribe of Judah comes first, so obviously that's an echo down in history to the tribe of Judah that's going to take the kingship eventually under King David. And then in Christian theology, obviously, it has tremendous implications as well. The kind of great, and the first person who's carrying it is this guy Nahshon ben Amminadab, right? So the story that harkens back to Exodus. There's this very famous midrash, which is sort of a commentary kind of on the Bible. And the story of Nahshon ben Amminadab is that Nahshon is the person who, at the splitting of the Red Sea, when, if you recall, God says to the people, go forward, and they're like, what are you talking about? And Moses starts praying, and God says, no, you have to go forward. So the legend is that Nahshon ben Amminadab, this specific guy, is the guy who walked into the water up until it reached above his nose, and at that point, God split the sea.
So he was the natural leader there.
Yes.
You know that's even, this is a little biological interlude. I was talking to Temple Grandin, who knows more about herd animals than anyone else in the world. You know that cows have natural leaders, and that cowboys who know their herds, they move the leader, and all the cows follow. And then, if you take your cows on a long trip, imagine you numbered them in sequence when they pass through a chute, and they just do that of their own accord. Then you take them like on a 3-month trek, and you run them through the chute again, they'll run through the chute in the same order. So there's a natural hierarchy of leadership, and that the cows who are leaders have now I don't remember what the set of distinct physiological characteristics are, but they have a set of distinct physiological characteristics. And all the cows know who the leader is.
Usually.
Yeah, charisma, that's right. Their face shines.
Yeah. I want to just point out something that, maybe it's been obvious since the beginning, but this is maybe a place to point it out, is that Israel is not just one thing. Like Israel is already a multiplicity inside a unity. So the way that God conceives Israel is that it has already that fractal structure. And so if you think of, from the time of Napoleon up to the Chinese totalitarianism, you can see there's a tendency to want to impose uniformity through the system. Localism is seen as something bad, which opposes unity. But in the text, localism is part of unity, right? It's
and
actually
part of diversity.
Exactly. So yeah,
this is so interesting because the people who push diversity now are anti-hierarchical, and the problem is they sacrifice unity. And so the proposition in this text is that hierarchy is the structure that optimally balances the necessity of unity with the necessity of diversity.
And that in some ways it all starts actually from the bottom, not the top. I mean, it's oriented towards the top, but we've seen this, I think we've talked in previous episodes, haven't we, that there's this kind of this gradual development from, just a single individual to a couple to a family to a clan to a tribe and then all the way up to a nation, and yet here we go right back to the building blocks, and it's really, it's profoundly countercultural. It is so unfashionable to talk about, tribalism is just a byword for kind of primitivism, and we should really be thinking, the Enlightenment vision is the brotherhood of man, kind of universal humanity.
It's also countercultural to point out that hierarchy is the means by which peaceful diversity can be attained.
Right. Correct.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you fragment,
this
so the notion would be if you fragment the hierarchy.
Burke's platoons, these are
exactly.
That's where it's got to start, and it builds up.
Well, it's the same throughout the natural kingdoms, right? Because all animals, virtually all animals, even those that aren't social, are hierarchical. And there has to be a multiplicity of animals, but they have to organize themselves. And it's so fundamental. This is so fundamental. Argument I've tried to make publicly is that your serotonergic system tracks your hierarchical position, and it's actually the system that sets up the architecture of your brain. Like, it's an unbelievably fundamental system, and one of the things it's primarily concerned with is hierarchical placement, and that's a reflection of the logos idea, the natural logos, that there's an ordering principle in nature itself to unite multiplicity and unity, and that's hierarchy.
Hierarchy is also forms of tyranny, dictatorship, imperial empires, and so on.
But we're saying the opposite, that hierarchy tends to be authoritarian.
How do you distinguish the two?
I think
this is covenantal, clearly.
That's how you distinguish it. So I would say to some degree that, the radical leftist claim is that all hierarchies are expression of power. And I would say, no, all corrupt hierarchies are expression of power. A genuine hierarchy, and this would be a hierarchy that wouldn't be predicated on an ideology. It would be predicated on something like a valid covenant. A valid hierarchy serves the proper vertical and horizontal purpose. So it serves the purposes of propagating social organization. You see this in chimpanzee hierarchies and in hierarchies of rats. But in human beings, it also serves that vertical axis that's the true uniting principle of the psyche and the social group at the same time.
That's exactly right. And this is why in the Bible, when it describes kingship, for example, it's not an absolute monarchy. It's effectively a constitutional monarchy, right? One of the commandments in the Bible is that the king, everybody is bound to write a Torah. You actually have to personally write a Torah, or at least you have to write a letter in a Torah is the modern practice. If you're wealthy enough, you can commission the writing of a Torah. But the king is supposed to write two. Right? He's supposed to write one that he carries, and he's supposed to carry it around on his person at all times in the Bible. And he's bound by the dictates of the Torah, which is why when you get to later books of the Bible, you end up having prophets who are coming and chiding the king.
Right.
Well, where do you have that?
Well, so monarchy is a modern question. It's like it's an image of
and a very primitive question, right? It goes all the way back to Mesopotamia, and it goes all the way forward to the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah, well, right. And so what we have here, we have the dawning of the question of by what standard should a monarch be bound? And one answer would be, well, only by the dictates of his own power. But obviously the prophets in the Old Testament object to that continually because they remind the kings constantly.
Samuel
it's like, don't forget you're properly subordinate to something, to the principle of divine sovereignty itself.
Exactly.
And
that's right. The Hebrew kings had no legislative power. It's purely negative powers that they're told, isn't it?
They have sort of the necessary and proper clause of the Bible, right? Which is like to achieve X purpose, you have the power to do what's necessary to achieve that. But yeah, I mean, it's a system where the king can be deposed. I mean, Saul is crowned the king by Samuel, and then Samuel comes back and he says, "You've lost the kingship; it has been torn away from you, and it's given to this other guy."
But I, for one, I'm very leery of hierarchical power.
I think that
it's so often tyranny.
Right.
And even your left-wingers who are suspicious of it, they talk diversity, end up with uniformity. They talk freedom and end up with tyranny.
Well, it's no doubt that one of the... We've already established this to some degree. Is imagine that there's a meet and proper hierarchical organization, but there's two eternal enemies of that. And one would be the proclivity of it to degenerate into a false unity that's tyranny, and the other would be for it to fall into the clutches of chaotic nature. And you see that in religious battles symbolically throughout history, is that you can be battling, let's say, with the forces of the tyrannical giant, or you can be battling with the forces of the devouring dragon of chaos, which is generally given a feminine cast, the eternal enemies of proper order. And then you might ask too, like, modern people who might object to tyranny, let's say sort of axiomatically, would say, they have to say of the tyrant that he's contravening the proper authority. That's what makes him a tyrant. And then you might push them and say, well, then what's the proper authority? And they might say the will of the people. But then the problem with that is you can get a degenerate populism. And so unless you have the notion of the will of the people, which would be that horizontal axis, aligned with the proper strictures of like a benevolent tradition, it's something like that, which would be the community extending into the past, you can't hypothesize anything about the order that the tyrant is contravening. And then if you do object to tyranny, you're making the implicit assumption that there is a divine authority that the tyrant is contravening, right? So there's an implicit theism. It seems to me there's an implicit theism in the objection to tyranny.
Biblical hierarchy is God. That's it. Sorry. I mean, people don't like to hear that, but that is the ultimate freedom. Is when people believe that God is the source. That is why the American Declaration of Independence says that our rights come from the Creator. If they don't come from the Creator, they come from human beings. If they come from human beings, we're screwed. And that's so critical, we don't like to say it because people like the Islamic regime of Iran have so distorted the notion of God as the head of state, as so to speak. But that is what is ultimately, and then through the parent, as I mentioned in Honor Your Parents, but as you know, there's a beautiful verse in Exodus. A man shall fear his mother and father, but keep my Sabbaths. So why the rabbis asked, what's the juxtaposition? It sounds like a non sequitur. Yes, your parents are your authority. But if they tell you to violate my law comes first. God parents you.
They have to be subsidiary representatives.
By the way, and just one other point on this: the crowd that says no hierarchy, and they're only against the God hierarchy and the parental hierarchy and perhaps your rabbi or priest or minister's hierarchy. The Prime Minister of New Zealand said, I play this on my radio show regularly, if you do not hear it from the government, it is not true. If that is not tyranny, tyranny doesn't exist.
So one thing we might turn to for a second is, so imagine that we have this idea of a distributed hierarchy that's not a tyrannical hierarchy because it's a subsidiary to the proper unity.
That's right.
Then you might say, well, what's the proper unity? And this is partly what the biblical corpus is actually an examination of this. So we're made in the image of God, and what does that mean? Well, in Genesis, it means God is that which extracts habitable order out of the potential of chaos. It's something like that. And so And that is a principle. That's what we do in our life when we're learning and when we're on the edge and when we're in the zone of proximal development and when we're in dialogue, is we're doing exactly that. We're confronting chaotic potential and transforming it into the habitable order that is good. And that's not something arbitrary, right? It's something, it's a very tight balance. That's what you're doing when you're dancing with someone. That's what you're doing when you're playing. And so the idea that what's at the pinnacle of the proper hierarchy isn't something arbitrary. It's the process by which the entire proper order is initially established and maintained. And it's real. It's part of the spirit of proper communal organization, but it's also part of the spirit that unites us properly in gratitude with the generative traditions of the past. And because people, the relativists, they say, well, you just put something arbitrary in the highest place, and so your tyranny, your religious tyranny is no more different than any, it's no different than any other arbitrary tyranny. It's like, no, that's not true. It's the principle that's at the top. There is a principle that needs to be at the top for the whole game to proceed.
But
just
boy,
like,
do you need safeguards. In other words, say servant leadership is one safeguard.
Right.
You need a whole series.
Right. Well, that would
because
be
in a postmodern age, power is the currency. Hierarchy tends to be very dangerous.
Well, part of the insistence in the biblical corpus is that what did you call it? The servant
leadership?
Servant leadership, right. The highest should serve the lowest. That's presented in the biblical corpus as isomorphic with the spirit that confronts chaos and transforms it into habitable order. It just says they're expressions of the same underlying unity. And also, we could say that unity that manifests itself fractally is the spirit of adventure that calls to Abraham. It's the spirit of careful, cautious apprehension of the future that calls to Noah, and it's the spirit that leads the Israelites out of tyranny. It's all the same thing, and it's all an attempt to specify what that necessary unity is that produces the proper hierarchy.
I think there might be something else going on, and we're seeing in chapter 11 something very interesting, the slow dispersal of power from Moses to the 70 and then beyond. So we're getting to the point where, as it were, every individual within the, as it were, the hierarchy of the sort of political culture and structure of Israel has a kind of equal access to the divine, equal access to the sacred. So there is a hierarchy, but it's a kind of immanent hierarchy, and the principle that God was right at the top of the hierarchy, being mediated through Moses, is now that principle is starting to transcend every layer, every level of the Israelites.
Well, it's starting to break them down, by the way, right? Yeah. Because what's going to happen in the rest of this book is that the people are going to start experimenting with ideas of how the hierarchical power ought to be distributed, right? So in the aftermath of the sin of the spies, when it becomes clear that everybody's going to die in the desert, you have, which I'm sure get to, the story of Korah, which is who decides on essentially egalitarian politics, right? All of us have equal access to God. We don't need any hierarchy. The hierarchy is of no use to us. We have all equal, and that fails utterly as well. It's a really delicate thing. I mean, what you're pointing out, Oz, that it is delicate is something that's important to remember. It's something that has to be consistently cultivated and maintained, a proper hierarchy. It's not as though it just continues to stand.
Like, well, that's what religious practice is for, is to maintain that.
And indeed, the word hierarchy is a deeply religious word, because, I say this to please Jonathan, among other reasons, but, I think I'm right in saying that the word hierarchy is coined by Dennis, the Areopagite, pseudo-Dennis. And of course, etymologically, it's linked to the arche, the source or the principle, and the holiness of that principle. So we may be lulled into this idea of hierarchy in terms of brute force, but there's maybe a deeper sense of hierarchy, which is linked to this idea which we've come across repeatedly in our reading, that of the sacred, that of the holy, and the importance.
So it's the differentiation of the sacred. That's a proper hierarchy is the differentiation. Well, that's one sign.
Obviously, one has to be careful about inferences from etymologies, but I just think it's worth noting that it does have this sacral religious.
Well, we should also notice that sacrum is also the base of the spine, and it's what you rest on, right? So, if we're talking about etymology.
A quick plot question here about Moses' demotion. Do you think that, is this inevitable? Is this a result of the people complaining to him? Is it a result of him complaining to God?
It's pretty obviously him complaining to God. I mean, he goes to God and he asks for the demotion. And then the next thing that actually happens is you have the whole situation.
But it's not the first time he's done this.
But if
he did this at the beginning, and God gave him Aaron. And so it's like, it's just a continuation of this pattern.
So could he have done something different to not get the demotion, to not start the process of maturation?
So theoretically, the counterfactual seems to be that Moses could have just gone to God and said, the people want meat. And God says, okay, well, then they're going to get as much meat as they possibly want. But Moses is really, at this point, angry with the people that he is. And remember, this is a person who gave up his possibility of being the nation, right? God said to him, you can be the nation. No, I'm sticking with these guys. And here are these guys just being the worst. And so he says...
he's being driven crazy by their ingratitude.
This is
That's
correct.
why they keep coming back.
It
can drive you crazy ingratitude.
And by the way, and you see that because he later, like just a few paragraphs after this, what's going to happen is that there are a couple of other guys, and it's this really bizarre segment that seems completely unassociated with the plot line, where these two guys who are prophesying in the camp, right, Eldad and Medad, they show up and they're prophesying in the camp. And Joshua comes to Moses, he says, you should kill them. They're prophesying in the camp. You're the prophet. Why aren't you the one who's prophesying in the camp? And Moses says, what? If God chooses Eldad and Medad to talk to, then that's his problem. Like that's something that he gets to do. Moses is tired of being held solely accountable for the sins of the people.
So why do you presume that he's being demoted rather than being rewarded by the differentiation of responsibility?
I think it's the same thing in the narrative, meaning like he asks for the demotion, but it's precisely that makes everything unworkable. This is actually one of there's a lot of talk sort of in the commentaries in the portion of Jethro in Exodus, when Jethro comes to him and he says you should devolve authority down the line. There's actually a very, very hotly fought kind of what we call machloket, an argument over whether this is a good idea or a very bad idea. Meaning, like, it's a good idea in the sense that it makes things more workable for Moses, but it's a bad idea in the sense that Moses is the one with direct access to the divine who's going to make all the right decisions, right? The minute that you start to devolve authority, one of the problems is the people you devolve authority to can make some really bad decisions.
Right. But you can raise them up.
It's a problem. So it's the problem of mediation in general. This is what I was trying to bring up right at the outset. It's like in Aaron, if you look at it at the seed of Aaron, Aaron will show you the problem of mediation. So there's a grumbling. It's like, no, we want some mediation. So God relents and says, fine, you have Aaron. Aaron is the one who makes the tabernacle. Aaron is the one who makes the golden calf. It's like, those are the two possibilities. Any type of mediation is always subject to corruption because it's a mediation. And so in this text, we're seeing the same thing happen in different ways, which is, they say they want meat, like there's a relenting of God. And then later in the story, in the whole story, the Israelites say they want a king. All right, you have a king. It's like, well, it's a relenting. And that relenting has a positive and a negative aspect, just like all mediation.
God can still achieve his purposes through the kind of concessions
you can say that cosmically
he
will ultimately achieve through that mediation. It might even be the way that God processes through the world.
Also, the kind of giant overarching message is, it doesn't matter what system you guys choose, whether it's a king or a set of judges, or the question is, how are you orienting yourself to the divine? If you properly orient yourself to the divine, then the system that you choose is almost of no consequence, which, by the way, is kind of what Aristotle says, right? I mean, the basics, he says, like, any of these systems could theoretically work. The question is which one is most likely to work.
I think it's also important to say that it's easy to think about hierarchy as if it's this kind of, stacked thing, because in a certain sense that is what it is. But as if you could live without it. But there is no living without hierarchy. I mean, think about it in the simplest terms. For example, where do you learn the things that you learn? Let's say, where did you learn to love another human being? Or where did you learn a certain virtue? And it always comes down to that having been mediated for you by someone else or some other situation, whether it's a teacher, a friend, a parent, or whatever. And so it seems to me that even if you regard things as completely flat, your progress through time is still always being mediated. Well, your discoveries, for example.
Well, then let's use that to move back to the text, because that notion of your journeying through time being mediated by hierarchy is part of the remainder of this particular text. So remember, 14 to 27, order of the tribes. In the first place went the standard of the camp of the children of Judah according to their armies, and over his host was Nahshon, the son of Amminadab. Then we skip to 28. Thus were the journeyings of the children of Israel according to their armies. Jonathan pointed out, the text we skipped over talked about the hierarchical organization of the phalanx moving forward. And Moses said unto Hobab, the son of Raguel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we are journeying unto the place of which the Lord said, I will give it to you, the promised land. Come thou with us, and we will do thee good. For the Lord hath spoken good concerning Israel. And he said unto him, I will not go, but I will depart to mine own land and to my kindred. And he said, leave us not, I pray thee, forasmuch as thou knowest how we are to encamp in the wilderness, and thou mayest be to us instead of eyes. And it shall be, if thou go with us, yea, it shall be, that what goodness the Lord shall do unto us, the same we will do unto thee. And they departed from the mount of the Lord 3 days' journey, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord went before them in the 3 days' journey, to search out a resting place for them. And the cloud of the Lord was upon them by the day when they went out of the camp. And it came to pass, when the ark set forward, that Moses said, rise up, Lord, and let thine enemies be scattered, and let them that hate thee flee before thee. And when it rested, he said, return, O Lord, unto the many thousands of Israel. All right, so that's Numbers 10.
I love that just the last few verses. We actually say that quite a bit, like in Vespers services in the Orthodox Church, the rise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered. And you can see the difference between the two. So it's like God comes up, and then everything is scattered, and then when it comes down, then it's like a gathering in of so God returns, and it's a gathering in of the people. So it's like this beautiful image of, let's say, what it means to move out into the future, but what it also means to have a home and to be
Well, it
settled.
is that when you're moving forward towards the promised land, when you're moving forward toward a destination, that the obstacles scatter before you. Right? That's really what you're trying to do. Is you're trying to move forward in a manner that makes the obstacles scatter. And as you said, you need to return to recollect yourself and to rest.
I think it also reinforces, because I'm a big believer in repeating a point, lest people forget it, that God is the ultimate issue and the ultimate hierarchy. Let your enemies be scattered. It doesn't say let our enemies be scattered. It's important.
Right, so let's go to 11. Numbers 11. And when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled. And the fire of the Lord burnt among them, and consumed them that were in the uttermost parts of the camp. And the people cried unto Moses. And when Moses prayed unto the Lord, the fire was quenched. And he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burnt among them. And the mixed multitude that was among them fell a-lusting. And the children of Israel also wept again, and said, who shall give us flesh to eat? We remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all beside this manna before our eyes. And the manna was as coriander seed, and the color thereof the color of bdellium. And the people went about and gathered it, and ground it in mills, or beat it in a mortar, or baked it in pans, and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was as the taste of fresh oil. So they don't even notice they have heavenly food, and they're complaining about not being able to eat what they had under the tyrant.
Yeah, that's really the point.
Yeah. And when the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell upon it. Then Moses heard the people weep throughout their families, every man in the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly. Moses also was displeased. And Moses said unto the Lord, wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant? And wherefore have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all this people upon me? Have I conceived all this people? Have I begotten them? That thou shouldest say unto me, carry them in thy bosom, as a nursing father beareth the sucking child, unto the land which thou swearest unto their fathers? Whence should I have flesh to give unto all this people? For they weep unto me, saying, give us flesh that we may eat. I am not able to bear all this people alone, because it is too heavy for me. And if thou deal thus with me, kill me, I pray thee, out of hand, if I have found favor in thy sight, and let me not see my wretchedness. And the Lord said unto Moses, gather unto me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom thou knowest to be the elders of the people, and officers over them, and bring them unto the tabernacle of the congregation, that they may stand there with thee. And I will come down and talk with thee there, and I will take of the Spirit which is upon thee, and I will put it on them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with thee, that thou bear it not thyself alone. And say thou unto the people, sanctify yourself against tomorrow, and ye shall eat flesh, for you have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, who shall give us flesh to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you flesh, and you shall eat. You shall not eat 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 or 10, nor 20, but even a whole month, until it come out at your nostrils, and it be loathsome unto you, because that you have despised the Lord which is among you. That's part of the rejection of the manna, right? And you have wept before him, saying, why came we forth out of Egypt? And Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 footmen, and thou hast said, I will give them flesh, that they may eat a whole month. Shall the flocks and the herds be slain for them to suffice them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to suffice them? And the Lord said unto Moses, is the Lord's hand waxed short? Thou shalt now see whether my word shall come to pass unto thee or not. And Moses went out and told the people the words of the Lord, and gathered the 70 men of the elders of the people, and set them round about the tabernacle. And the Lord came down in a cloud, and spake unto him, and took of the Spirit that was upon him, and gave it unto the 70 elders. And it came to pass that when the Spirit rested upon them, they prophesied, and did not cease. But there remained 2 of the men in the camp. The name of the one was Eldad, and the name of the other Medad. And the Spirit rested upon them. And they were of them that were written, but went not out into the tabernacle. And they prophesied in the camp. And there ran a young man and told Moses, and said, Eldad and Medad do prophecy in the camp. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of Moses, one of his young men, answered and said, my lord Moses, forbid them. And Moses said unto him, enviest thou for my sake? Would God that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them. So he's actually happy that there's some devolution of the prophetic responsibility. And Moses gat him into the camp, he and the elders of Israel. And there went forth a wind from the Lord, and brought quails from the sea, and let them fall by the camp, as it were a day's journey on this side, and as it were a day's journey on the other side, round about the camp, and as it were 2 cubits high upon the face of the earth. It's like Quail City, man. Yeah. So is there also an inference in the text here that, what is it? Is there an inference that if the hierarchical order is properly devolved, then there will be plenty? And I'm asking this for a particular reason. You know, we have this notion now in the world that we have a zero-sum planet, and that we're playing a zero-sum game, right? There's finite resources. And one of the things God is saying here, I think, is that if the people are organized properly, then the bounty of the earth is boundless and without end.
Well, this is a punishment, right?
What I see, though,
I know.
Ben, I think that this text is very, very subtle. I think that what is being shown is both the positive and negative aspects of devolution at the same time.
Right.
And so God is showing, it's like one of the aspects of this, like flesh, like moving down into flesh, is, oh, these people are prophesizing. They're not in the hierarchy, but they're prophesizing. So this idea that like the Spirit of the Lord will fill the entire earth. But at the same time, the negative aspect is this, let's say, moving out into flesh and the fleshiness of that problem. So you kind of see these 2 things happening simultaneously, which is kind of crazy. It's like you see these, like a punishment and a blessing at the same time. But I think it has to do with the mystery of devolution, or the mystery of mediation, how that works.
It feels almost like it's an appropriate level of too muchness for them, the way that he put Moses in the rock and shielded him so that he couldn't see him in full. And it's almost an iteration of that. Like, you can't handle to see the full sight of me. And it's like, you want meat, it's down lower. Here's enough that it will overwhelm you. It'll come out your nostrils.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot here just in terms of what Moses wants, God gives to him also. And it turns out to be just a terrible decision, right? Because as soon as this authority devolves, the thing that never happens in the desert before, which is Moses gives an order and the people just say, okay. Now that the authority has been devolved, Moses starts giving orders, and people are like, nope.
This is
and things fall apart super fast.
It's the careful what you wish for section.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Right.
Well, I think it's important to remember that it's easy to regard this narrative as, kind of wilderness, sort of bad, promised land, good, as if, it's all about sort of getting there. I think that's a really profound kind of mistake, because I think what this revelation is giving us is a sense about the interdynamic, you might say, between wilderness and promised land, and they're not easily separable, right? You can be in a place of plenty, right, and then you can eat too much, and all of a sudden you find yourself in poverty, in a kind of spiritual poverty, right? You lose a sense of who you are. You ate too much. You sleep in. You lose everything else. And so, similarly, the wilderness. The wilderness is a place that God provides water and revelation and the law and all of that. And so I think...
And manna.
And so I think really what is... And there's a certain sense in which if you're too much in a certain sense of place of satiety, well, what do? You take on a discipline of fasting, because that discipline of fasting, of withdrawal, in fact, is what then clarifies your vision and makes you able to see again what you have forgotten. And so I think that there's a really... It's not clear to me that we ever are not, or should even want, not in a deep sense to be in a kind of wilderness. That is to say, the place where you can be receptive to the revelation. And so I think what really is here is it's about a kind of mediation, as Jonathan keeps saying, the relation between our state of a kind of spiritual longing and misdirection and ignorance, and the discovery of what that end really is, that is such that we can internalize or seek that end from within the time and finitude that is actually inescapable to us in this life, except in the sense that as you come to have that end revealed to you in that time and change, in a sense, you are transcending that as it is mediated to you.
So then you get the advantages of the particular and the particular adventure with the union of the infinite. That we talked about that a little bit with regards to the idea of veiling, is that you have the problem of the finite. You need a relationship with the infinite. It can't be a total relationship, because that would destroy you. It has to be, it's a balance. Again, it has to be enough of a relationship to sustain you in the desert, and then that turns into something approximating the proper promised land.
I mean, what you're talking about in terms of sort of the frailty of the wilderness, but that also being the place of repository of holiness, the Festival of Booths that we celebrate is specifically that, right? So that you're actually supposed to go out of your home and you build a fragile booth, and you live in this fragile booth for 7 days. Right. And it's supposed to be a place where you can, like the roof has to be built in such a way where the rain has to be able to come through, you have to be able to see the stars. It's supposed to be deliberately fragile, because we spend our lives trying to insulate ourselves from the wilderness. But the reality is that life is the wilderness. And so the idea when you're in the sukkah is that the sukkah is a better reflection of what life actually is, this very fragile thing in a transitory place. And that's why you have to keep your eyes, above you, and that's why you have to be surrounded by ritual in order to allow you to navigate that.
It's also a reminder to be grateful for what you have, right? Because I wonder if that's part of the reason why camping is such a ritual in say North America, is that people will just abandon all that for some time and go back and live in a tent and they say they're communing with nature, but I think part of it is also, it's gratitude for nature, but it's also a way of reestablishing gratitude for the comfort that you left. You camped for a week, that's enough camping. And then you remember what you have. And part of it, what does happen, as we already pointed out, as the Israelites are walking through the desert, is they forget and they falsify the past. And so that voluntary return is a way of remembering. So,
falling into the flesh is represented as forgetting. like everywhere in the church fathers. Like that's what it is, because it's not that flesh itself is bad, is that if you desire it and you kind of move into it, then that's what it is. You forget the source of it. You forget what is the origin.
And that's the violation of that verticality,
right,
I would say.
It seems like the ingratitude. Am I the only one who's reading Moses's discussion or complaints to God as also expressing that ingratitude?
Elaborate.
Well, I think he's complaining about their ingratitude. I'm on Moses' side here. I'm as pissed at them as he is.
You have a counter case to make?
Well, I think that in the dialogue, as he's talking, it sounds very, have I conceived all this people? Right? You did this. Can't you handle this?
Well, they keep saying to each other, your people, my people, whatever they're annoyed with them.
So you see a hint.
Look what your daughter did.
Do you see a hint of ingratitude in Moses?
Yeah, it feels like the ingratitude emerges from the camp and sort of infects. He's human, and he's exhausted, and he's getting older.
Look, Moses didn't want the job from the beginning.
But
this is another problem of leadership. You don't want leaders who want to lead, and you don't want leaders who don't want to lead. There's no perfect answer. Ideally, you don't want ambitious, I'm dying for power.